here at Colgate. She has also worked at the Segoe Cultural Center in Oneida, where she has been involved with the Oneida Language Revitalization Program, among other projects. Lisa has a Master of Science in Communication Studies from Ithaca College. I also want to welcome Michelle Shenandoah, who is also an Oneida Nation Wolf Clan member. She is the daughter of Oneida Nation faith keeper Diane Shenandoah and granddaughter to the late Oneida Nation Wolf Clan mother Maisie Shenandoah. Michelle is a visionary thought leader among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and beyond, and particularly has done a lot to help bring together Haudenosaunee women from across the Confederacy. She has worked as a consultant to businesses and film production companies and has provided support to Native American artists. She is also the founder of a new magazine, Repatriation Magazine, which is an exciting new online storytelling platform where Haudenosaunee women gather to collect for collective healing from historical and current trauma, while gaining empowerment through new narratives. Michelle also has a JD and LLM in corporate tax law from New York Law School, where she focused on American Indian law and policy. Both Lisa and Michelle have also served in leadership for the Seven Dancers Coalition, a nonprofit that's focused on ending sexual assault and violence in the Indigenous community. I feel very privileged to have met both Lisa and Michelle and gotten to know them in the past year, and I'm very, very happy that you have accepted our invitation to join us and come and share your work, your very important and powerful work with us here at Colgate. Please join me in giving them a very warm welcome.
I'm Michelle Shenandoah. Galukia Nues is my native name, which means that she's fond of the sky. And
Sikoli swagwe disi nyangets kawastu just nyangets and wene tahioni ni wadiki dolo unyat agani e. Which means my name's Lisa. And my Indian name means she throws icicles, so that is exactly what it means.
And I swear we're really smart women. I just caught this grammar error because, like, in haste this morning, I was rushing to get this in because we're co-presenting today, and normally I'm, usually presenting on my own as is Lisa. So I want to take you through a little bit about who we are, and you'll see why we're talking about this being a woman's journey to healing. And help to orientate you and understand a little bit more about the Haudenosaunee people, in particular the Oneida. We call ourselves the Onyoteata people. And so that's the people of the standing stone. So welcome to our homeland, and we hope that you're having a good time while you're here. Just a little bit about me. You heard I went to law school. I have 2 degrees in law, and I actually ended up coming back around to work with our Haudenosaunee women, and I'm not working in law at the moment because it became very pressing to me when I came home where the greatest need is, and that's with our women. And so here's my family. We have my husband Neil, who's in the back here with our youngest son. We have 4 kids and a new little puppy. Her name is Sugar. And so my husband and I were married in the traditional way within our longhouse. We are Haudenosaunee means the people of the longhouse, and so that's a little bit about who I am. Oh, you have a mic now. Okay.
This is me and my mother and my youngest son, Kevin, and our puppy. And the reason we got this puppy is because he looks like Chewbacca, like the Star Wars thing. This is my oldest son, and like Michelle said, that we both have gone to school and we worked in our selective studies. But then when we come home, we realized where the need was, and one of the needs that I realized was the empowerment of our own women, and that's what Michelle's going to touch on today. And I don't know if you guys know that it was the Haudenosaunee women that influenced the women's rights movement. And Michelle will talk about that today. So when we came back home, and we're full of all this spit and vinegar and ready to take on the world, and we look around and not all our sisters are like that. So our goal was to make sure that we got them back to where they're supposed to be these leaders, and to remind us who we are.
Yeah, I'm just going to go over here. see the time because I don't see a clock in here. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Let's see. Okay, so I think it's really important for you to understand in terms of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. How many of you are new to the area? Good number in here. And so how many of you in here are familiar with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy? Even less. Okay, good. Well, this will be a nice little overview today. So we're comprised of 6 nations, and when you start in the east, you start in Albany, sort of where the Hudson River and the Mohawk River come together. And there is, from there all the way to about Utica are the territories of the Mohawk. From Utica, almost up to Syracuse are the lands of the Oneida, and then from covering that area of central New York in Syracuse, over to about Cayuga Lake is then the Onondaga territories, and from Cayuga over to Seneca Lake is the Cayuga and then Seneca territories, and the Tuscaroras were actually from North Carolina and joined us in the late 1600s. It was the Oneidas who adopted them in, and we became the Six Nations Confederacy. But over 1,000 years ago, we were formed under what we call the Great Law. And so we are matrilineal societies, and just like Lisa pointed to, it was the Haudenosaunee women who influenced the women's rights movement. And so in order to understand why and how that happens, you have to understand who we are, right? And so we're matrilineal societies, and so what does that mean? And in order to understand that, you have to go all the way back to the Haudenosaunee creation story, which is the beginning of time. And there is another world, and the thing about Haudenosaunee stories, there's really never a true beginning. We always jump in the middle of a story, and we've been criticized for that, but that's who we are. So we came from another world that existed and still exists that we call Sky World. And in that space was a woman who was pregnant, and she fell or she was pushed, and she came into this world, and it was only water at the time. And so she fell from another universe, another planet, and she came here, and the geese came and they caught her on her fall before she hit the earth. And they came down and they brought her onto a turtle's back. So if you've ever heard this expression called Turtle Island, you'll hear a lot of Native American people refer to that. That's what we're talking about, because she came down onto a turtle's back. From there, there's a really, really long story. You're getting a very super, super abbreviated version today, just so you can understand the concept of our worldview. And so she built the world. She built the land that was on top of the turtle's back and began to cultivate different types of foods. And she gave birth to a daughter then in her time here on Earth had also then become pregnant, and they say that it was either Turtle Man or the West Wind in which she became impregnated, and she gave birth to twins. And there was a right-handed twin and a left-handed twin, and they created the entire world that we see around us, including human beings. And so when those twins were born, one of them actually ended up killing his mother in that process. And so she was buried into the earth, and the grandmother raised the twins. And from her body grew sacred things that we consider today. So there's another another concept that we call the three sisters, which are the corn, beans, and squash. And those were things that grew from her body, as well as the sacred tobacco. When you think about tobacco and the origins of tobacco, you think of Native people. Well, that's one of the things that we have, is that sacred tobacco that also grew from her body. So if you think about it, like right from the very beginning, it starts with a woman, right? The world starts with a woman. And then is a story of another woman, right? And then we have the two men who enter into the story, who are a part of that creation. And it is a balance. It's a balance between men and women, but it's very important to understand where it starts, right? And you're going to see how that continues. So once humans were created, through time, as we started to multiply, chaos started to develop. And that's pretty common, right? That's human nature. You get a lot of us all together, chaos happens, you need to bring back order. And so in that process, we didn't know how to deal with death. And so people would start to die and we didn't understand it. We're new human beings. We don't understand what's going on. And so a young boy actually had a vision come to him, which was the creation of a clan system. And so he asked for the elder women from these different large families to very early in the morning go down to the river and to fetch some water and then to see what was the first animal that they saw in the morning and to come back and to report it. And so when they came back, some women had seen a heron, or some saw an eel, and some saw, or one, I'm sorry, not some, one, right? Each woman, one saw the heron, one saw the eel, one saw a turtle and a wolf and a beaver and a deer, and then two women had seen a bear. And so they came back and they each reported that, and then this became the clans for each of those families. So for the two women who had seen a bear, they both saw one on the opposite sides of this water. And most of the women had seen the animals on one side of the water or the other. And so we began to structure our clan systems, what we call like a division, two sides of the house. And one side would be primarily the water animals and the other would be the land animals. And so in that, we didn't know where the bears fell. And so the two women and the young boy had to make a decision. What side will the bear be on? Because we can't have bears on both sides. And so there's three-part process going on in the two sides of the house. And this is important for you to remember because that three-part process of making a decision is something that you interact with in your systems in the United States every day. Does anybody know what that might be? We'll come back to that. All right. So, so from there, what happens when we have our clan system? Let me go back to the slide. It'll make a little more sense. When we have our clan system, so now what happens is, see, we're both Wolf Clan, and that makes us family, right? And so technically, we're sisters, even though we're not blood relations. So what happens if somebody who's on the other side of the house, if they lose a family member, it's now up to us and our clans on this side of the house to go take care of them, and vice versa if we have a loss in our family. So this is how we began to take care of each other, because when death was happening, right, we didn't know how to handle it, but there was also that loss and that crying, right, that grieving, because we all understand, when you lose somebody, you have that deep sense of sadness, and you can't really complete your daily tasks. You can't see, you can't think straight, you can't speak, you can't see, you can't hear. And so it's a responsibility of the clans on the other side to take care of each other. But going back to those women who first saw those animals, they became our clan mothers. And so what happens is we have clan mothers in our family. Her mom is a clan mother, my grandmother's a clan mother. This is ancient. This goes way, way, way back to early times of human beings. And that clan system we still have in place today. And the clan is passed through the woman. So some of you in here who are scientists and studying, you probably know more about this than I do. But there's the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed through the woman. And that only can be passed through the woman, right? So I see some of you nodding your head yes, and I already know you know more about it than I do, but we know about it on a spiritual level, because what happens is we understand that something, there's a sacred relationship that happens. So you can see it in scientific terms, and we saw it on a spiritual level, meaning that something is passed from the mother to her children. And for us, that's the clan, and that always passes on. And as well as those titles of clan mother, right? So clan mother passes down into her family as it does with mine as well. Is there
It's a
something?
test of the system.
Okay. All
I
right.
wanted to test it right now.
Okay. Good. Everybody paying attention? So you can see, again, what's the thread? It has a lot to do with women, right? And so that is what, again, going back to that influence that we had upon the settlers of this country, right? So I'm going to go back to that three-part system. How many of you know the inspiration, the influence for the Constitution and the U.S. government? Does anyone in here know? Besides the professors? Okay. All right. So what's really important to know is that the founding fathers of this country spent a lot of time with our people, and they studied us, and they built the Constitution and the framework for the U.S. government based upon how we operate and how our government functioned. So Lisa, you can pop in anytime. Feel free to add to what I'm sharing here. But in terms of that three-part process, you have three parts to your government, right? In terms of being able to make a fair decision. And when you're looking at the different sides of the House, right? You have your Senate and you have, what's the other one?
House of Representatives.
There you go, right? So those are little simple things that you can see are not so simple. It's actually really highly sophisticated. Now, where do you all think democracy came from?
And I'll show you how you don't, maybe you don't believe us, but see this guy up here isn't legal. Where do you think they got the eagle from on your dollar bill and stuff, right? And then what's the other one? Oh, you know that bundle of arrows that you see on your dollar bill? Who do you think those arrows belong to? They belong to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. That's our symbol of the 5 arrows together, which she'll talk about in a minute. So that's just showing you on a simpler to understand level that, yeah, they were watching us because they liked the way we conducted our business. They seen that it was fair, and they seen that they wanted to do stuff like we did. And was it Benjamin Franklin? Good old Benjamin Franklin got his ideas from us, but one thing he forgot.
What do you think he forgot? What is it?
No.
It's comprised of more than 50% in this room. Women. Totally left out women. It was on purpose. So now the fact that the influence of this government that was newly formed was founded upon who we are as people, right? We were the inspiration. Now, in American women were left out of that. What do you think that did for Haudenosaunee women? Just curious. Feel free to shout out your ideas. So, when we move a little bit further in time, again, chaos ensued, and our people came to war with each other. And we had really brutal blood wars that existed among all Haudenosaunee people and even beyond that. There was a prophet that was born to us, a spiritual messenger that was born to us. And he came to a woman who actually was one of these clan mothers, and they also called them corn mothers because the women also were in charge of the economies. So we were in charge of the fields of corn, and that was our economy. So Jagunsase was one of these women who they also say she stirred up the pot, right? So she helped to fuel the war. And the peacemaker came to her, and the peacemaker came and brought this great message of peace. And that message of peace, she accepted. She was the very first one to accept this. And she then became one of his helpers and traveled among all of our nations to help to bring this message of peace and to bring us to a greater place. And again, going back to the women. So what happened is, I'm flashing forward. I mean, when people tell these stories, they can take up to 10 days to go through and tell all the level of detail for these stories. So you were literally just getting like skim of the surface on them. So Jagunsa was one of these helpers, and she was the peacemaker brought a system to us under what we call the Great Law, and it was comprised of 50 chiefs, and then we have 50 clan mothers who were under this as well. And when you think about it, the clan mothers were the ones who were working at the local level. They listened to the people, they listened to all of the issues, they tried to help to, make things right. And when things can't be solved, then it's brought up before the chiefs, which then it can be handled at another level. And then the chiefs work together between the nations, as did our clan mothers, to be able to help our nations to work together. So they're working more at that federal level, and the clan mothers are working at that local state level, right? So again, something else that you can see in terms of the influence that we had upon the government. So there's a lot of stories in terms of how it all came together. We had a man who they called Tadadaho, who was, some people say, an evil sorcerer, right? So he was somebody who had a lot of power, which he used in a very negative way to kill others and to cause them harm. And they say that the peacemaker and Jagunsa, and then they did have one other helper named Hiawatha, were able to bring peace to Tadadaho. Do you have something you want to say, Lisa?
You all know Hiawatha, right? Yeah? You guys know who Hiawatha is? That's not the one we're talking about. We're talking about our Hiawatha, not the one in the book of Longfellow or whatever the guy wrote. So when she says Hiawatha, this is the man that actually, the reason he was so important is because he could speak all the languages, because they say that the peacemaker, either he had a speech impediment or he couldn't speak the languages. The stories changed, so Hiawatha knew all the languages, so as he went across the Confederacy with these two important people, he could translate to each because each of our nations has a different dialect, and so that's who Hiawatha is. And so if you hear Hiawatha, that's not the Hiawatha we're talking about. We're talking about the Hiawatha that belongs to us.
Mm-hmm. And so the Tadadaho, they say that he was so wicked that he had snakes growing from his hair, right? And so as they were trying to approach him, Tadadaho was sending a lot of energy to be able to, prevent their travel towards them, that they couldn't, get through a lake. This is actually Onondaga Lake. I'm sure you've seen that when you have flown in. So as they were traveling across this lake to come to meet him, because he was Onondaga, and that's where his title still resides, but they were able to calm him. And they say that with the songs that they sang to him, they were able to soothe him, and then they were able to comb the snakes from his hair with these messages of peace and with these songs. And so he then was given the position of leader, the first leader among all the Haudenosaunee people, but he's equal to everybody. So he then had responsibility for all the people, for all the Haudenosaunee nations. So imagine you're this really evil, wicked person, then all of a sudden you're given responsibility to take care of people, right? There's a lot of power in that. So there had to be a lot of forgiveness that happened. We're going from a time of war to a time of peace. And how does that happen, right? How do you make that happen? Well, the ways in which we did this are very spiritually based, but it's based on the concepts of peace and using a good mind, what we call Gatnigoleo. It's a good mind. So the practices that you think of, like mindfulness, I'm just trying to think of some of the other religions that are out there. They talk about using a good mind, but understanding that there's a spiritual energy that's connected to it. So if you do good for others, that goodness will continue to grow. You smile at someone, they're going to smile back, right? It is that simple. So we had to start using the concept of a good mind, and that's really deeply rooted in who we are and in our principles of peace. So when we greet each other, we actually say Skanagoga, right? And Skana is a word for peace. So what we're actually saying is that I'm really grateful that peace is within you today. Yeah.
Your reply would be synagogue. They're asking, is there peace within you? And you reply, yes, there is peace within me. So that's kind of like the Star Wars thing, right? Do you understand why I like Star Wars? Well, let me just interrupt real quick. So the reason why Tadadaho is so important, or not, yeah, Tadadaho is so important, they were like, why would you want somebody that's so evil and a sorcerer? Why would you want him to be part of your gang, right? But if you realize where we are located and where Onondaga is located, it's right in the middle of our whole confederacy, right smack dab in the middle. And you look at it now and you're like, oh, Onondaga Nation is this little tiny, postage stamp. But back then, it was the whole entire strip, all the way up, all the way down. So in order to bring all 5 of these at the time together, they had to go through Onondaga. Now, you couldn't go around Onondaga because it was too far. And if you tried to go through Onondaga, Tadadaho would get you. So that's why it was so important to convince him to become a peaceful, loving human being, to join this message of peace. And so that's why they worked so hard to get Tadadaho to join them. So I just wanted to point that out.
So again, this is, they show Jigonsasei here combing the snakes out of his hair, and here's the peacemaker singing to him. So he went through a spiritual transformation. And I think that's really important to note, because one of the other things too that happens in the U.S. government, and I know it gets complicated, but there's this separation of church and state, right? We don't consider our quote unquote religion a religion; it's a way of life. And so these principles of peace are really important because we were a very highly evolved government. So the two go hand in hand. Spirituality and government go hand in hand. You might argue with me, but it worked and it still exists. And this happened over 1,000 years ago. And it still exists today. So I think that's really important to note. So when you think about being here on the lands of the Haudenosaunee people, this is not an extinct culture. We're here to tell you of children of leadership within this structure of government that's created, as well as my husband who's here in the back. His father was a chief at the Onondaga Nation, right? So it still exists. It's here. You just have to look. And actually, you don't need to look too far because we're in the room with you.
I'm on campus with you.
So this right here represents who we are, right? So when this all was ratified, what they say is that our people buried our weapons of war underneath a great white pine tree. So this became the tree of peace, and it said that those principles of peace are sent out into the 4 directions of the world on these white roots, the 4 sacred white roots that go and spread around the world. And an eagle rests on top here to be able to look out over the people and to look out over the lands to watch for danger. And if there ever is danger, it will notify us through making a call out to the people. And then here, right here, this is what they call the Hiawatha Belt, and this represents each of our nations. So when you start in the eastern side of the state, you really can look at it like when you look at the state next time, imagine this being laid over across the state of New York. So you have the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And like we said, the Tuscarora were adopted in here, but as you see, these connectors here go off to the edge. And that means that more people, more nations are able to come in and to join our Confederacy, as they did. So I talked with you a little bit about the Great Law, a peaceful way of living, respecting all of life and giving thanks for all of life. We are the oldest living democracy on earth in existence. Oldest. And I say that because your books will sometimes tell you that it's the Greeks, and it's not.
But we're grabbing our own narrative, and we're showing you right now, because this would never happen years ago. 2 women up here talking about this. They would have to have degrees in history and degrees in Iroquois studies and stuff like that. But we don't need the degrees in Iroquois studies. We don't need outsiders telling us, oh, you need to have a degree in that division in order to talk about it. No, we've lived it. We know our history, and the reason we history is because one of the reasons why I'm here, and we'll get to that in a minute too.
Yeah. So this is really important, this veto power. So I went through all these pieces, and that's held by women. So we talked about clan mothers. Now they talk about leadership on the span of a hand, okay? So there's a clan mother, and the clan mother selects her chief. She also selects 2 faith keepers who are her helpers, a male and female faith keeper, and then there's a sub-chief who's the helper to the chief, right? But it's the clan mother who chooses the chief. And she also has the right of recall. So that means that if he starts acting for his own self-interest, and he's not acting for the people, she can take away that leadership position that he has. That's one of the other things that was left out of the structure of the U.S. government. So imagine if Trump had a clan mother. Just saying. Okay. So stronger together, weaker as one. That's those arrows that are bound together. So when our Confederacy was formed, there's also binding those arrows, and you'll see it on your dollar bill. Look at it next time, because you're stronger together and weaker as one. So we had talked about the suffragettes and women's rights movement. So you can see how the influence was there. So when these white women who were here living among our lands, they were the property of their husbands. I'm sure most of you know this in your women's studies, for those of you who are in that. But by law, the moment that a woman became married, she was the property of her husband, as were her children. She didn't have any rights. He had the right to beat her. He had the right, I'm trying to remember the expression, but it has something to do with like the thickness of a cord, but it's written in the law. Rule of thumb, thank you, that's what it is, the rule of thumb, that he had the right to beat her with something that was as thick as his thumb, and legally that was totally perfectly acceptable. And so when those women were here with our women, we had absolute autonomy over our bodies, over our thoughts. We owned the homes that we lived in. So going back to the story of the clan mothers, that clan mother and her family, all the matrilineal family, lived in that longhouse together. And when someone got married, or when a couple got married, the man would move into the clan mother's longhouse. So it was, the domain was of the women, as was the food. Now, why would you want to upset women? Because it's your house, it's your food, right? And so that's what these suffragettes saw. That's who they were living among. It's no coincidence that Seneca Falls is what they call the birthplace of women's rights, right? Because that's what they saw.
When the settlers, when they first arrived and they seen how the men would come first and the women were left behind, like in the background, they thought that the women were less than. That wasn't the case. The men went first because they wanted to make sure that those women were safe. So they immediately assumed that our women were less than, just like white women were less than to them. That wasn't the case. They wanted to make sure that there was cultural continuation and that there would always be able to bring up more chiefs. So if all those men that went ahead first to greet the settlers or to greet the invaders, if they were all slaughtered, that's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but I mean, if you lost your leaders, your clan mothers were still here and they could raise more leaders. So that's also what they got wrong when they stole all our chiefs at one point in history. They stole all the chiefs and took them to France or something like that. And so they're like, oh, well, we got all their chiefs. And we're like, okay, well, guess what? We got more waiting in the wings and we have more warriors waiting in the wings. That's what they didn't understand because of their colonist mentality. And so they tried to force that onto our women here, our Haudenosaunee women, because to this day, they're still, you'll meet us, you'll see us and you think, oh, they're so nice and sweet and quiet. But we're not, we still have that memory, we have that historical memory that's been passed down. And once you ignite that memory, boy, oh boy, imagine that, huh? Yeah, imagine that, to remember the kind of women that we once were. So, I just wanted to let you guys know that the way that they perceived us was not exactly what we were. So that was one of their biggest mistakes. And when we influenced the women, my dad's not Native, and when he talks about this himself, he says the suffragettes are claiming all this greatness, and what they did is they had their servants. Yeah, that's right. We were their servants, and they influenced them. They said, "What are you doing? Why are you letting him beat you like that? What the heck's wrong with you? Wake up!" And so that was the type of influence we have on other women, and it was shown. I don't want to jump ahead, Michelle. I don't know where you're going with this. We never speak together because we're always doing separate things, and so this is really cool to be here with her. One of the things I was always taught not to get involved in politics, and so one of my friends from Oneida Nation, she called me up and she said, "You want to go to the Women's March with me?" And I said, "No, I better not get involved in politics." And then just something in me is like, I'm gonna go. So I went because I knew what was coming. So it was really awesome. I get down there, and my partner, he went with me. And so we get down, and we had a whole bus full of women from all across the Confederacy, from every nation was represented. And so we get down, and we're dressed in our ribbon shirts and ribbon dresses, and we're holding our Confederacy flag. And so we get down, and the minute we get off the bus, all we hear is all this cheering. I'm like, "Oh, what are you cheering for?" And they were cheering for us because they knew that we were there. And they knew who we were. They're like, "There's the Women's Union. We're here, actually here." And they paid for the bus to get us there. Somebody donated this bus for us to come down there. We don't know who it was, but somebody paid for this bus, and so we all showed up. So then we get down here, and all these white women are coming up to us and saying, "Thank you." We laughed to say white women. Well, they were a whole bunch of white women. They're coming up to us and saying, thank you so much." And we're like, "Oh, you're welcome." Okay. We didn't understand. And then we started to go into the parade and everything, and get on the train and all that stuff. So as we're on the train, we're just doing what every Haudenosaunee women do when you're sitting together and you're bored. What do? You sing. So we started singing, and the whole train was like, "Oh no, whoa, the Indians are here," kind of thing. So they're getting nervous, that all the white men were getting nervous, but the white women, they're like, "Oh cool, they're here." So then as we started to walk, it was just like the craziest thing. You guys seen the pictures? I don't know if was anybody there? Yeah, you were there. Did you see all them people? It was like we were like walking like this, right, like stuck together. The minute we stepped onto that road, they parted. They just split right in half. It was magical. I was like, "Oh my goodness!" And we're walking, and we're looking around, and I'm carrying this flag, and my girlfriends are carrying the flag, and my partner, when we travel somewhere, we have people like protectors around us to make sure nothing happens, and we just happen to have 4 men, north, south, east, west, just happened to come out that way, and he was watching too, and he said that it looked like a stadium. When they do the wave and it goes around the whole stadium? That's what they did when we walked in. The whole place. We're like, holy crap, because we didn't understand. We knew who we were, but they knew more of who we were. It was a big deal for us to be there. So at that point in my head, I'm like, oh my goodness, I know they're not cheering for me because I'm just Lisa. I didn't do anything great. So I knew they were cheering for my mother, for her grandmother, for her great grandmother, for all our great grandmothers, all the way back up. Because they're the ones that gave those white women a voice, right? We're the one that told them, "Stand up for yourself. What's wrong with you, girl? Come on. Don't let them beat you like that. Tell them what you want." And so that's what ignited my journey. And since then, it's been this crazy, crazy, crazy whirlwind of about 2 years now, right? About 2 years. So that links me up with Michelle, because Michelle's been doing this kind of stuff forever, because that's what she does. But we started doing this. We actually read this book, and this book was called The Gun Oasis. Anti-Racist.
Yeah.
And it's about the women, American women, Indigenous women, and it talks about all these stories that we're telling you about, and it's told in a woman's voice. And so when we start getting these stories, I'm like, oh my goodness, I never knew that, because they took all those stories away from us. All those stories about Tecumseh, they took those stories out. We didn't know all those stories. And I asked my mom, I said, "Mom, is this true?" And she's like, "Yeah, that's true." I go, "How come nobody ever told us that?" She goes, "I don't know." And then these little tiny stories that we kept asking, "Is that true?" I search every history book. I've been all over the place looking in history books, asking our elders, listening to podcasts the whole time I've been studying these, turning out this book. Yes, it's all true. So that's when you understand what happened to our women. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do is to make sure that we reignite that spark that's in our women that gave the white women of America this voice. And it's just an amazing journey we've been on for the past 2 years. And so one of the things that you guys that were here, why we're here, because they talk about some of these pictures of the
Yeah. So we'll go ahead and.
well, when every time they start something, they say you're on the land of the Oneida Nation, right? And you guys hear that. Did you ever really think about it? Oh, who are these Oneida people? Oh, they own a casino. They're rich people, and blah, blah, blah. So when you talk about this, the people whose land you're on, these are our clan mothers right here.
You
See
can
them?
click on them and they should be a little bigger.
We'll go bigger.
Yeah, those are some of the Oneida clan mothers and faith keepers. And see these ribbon skirts? Aren't they beautiful? I don't be trying to copy them and wear them around because we gotta be in the club to do that. And this is Chenandoah Falls, and this is one of the. We actually had this gathering, and that Michelle got together, and all the women across the Confederacy helped put together, and we had this gathering up at Benondigan, and we bring all these women from all over the Confederacy together, and they don't know each other. Not like they did back in the day, so we ignited this friendship. So then because of that, we got the Oneida women together, the ones that you seen on that rock a minute ago. These women haven't been together in over 200 years. Them. See this rock here? Where's this rock? That's one of our rocks too. You know how we know that's one of our rocks? They call the Oneida the people of the standing stone. And the reason why is because the stone followed us around, and that's how we knew where our homes are going to be, our villages. And they say that the rock followed us around, or we followed the rock around. All we know is that that's our name. This is one of our rocks. We've been following these rocks around for the past summer and trying to find all our rocks, and this is one of them. And how do we know that? Is because it's a different kind of rock. And the rocks, you know, the glacial plains that move. They moved these big rocks, so that's how we know that this is where we were. This is one of our villages. So there's our girls, and you know, people probably think we're crazy that we're hugging this rock. I was up there hugging a rock.
We don't care what you
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
Crazy or
And
not.
somebody was having a big serious conversation with her, and I'm walking in, oh, it's rock. And they're looking at me, oh, hello, and I just keep hugging the rock. So this is our rock, and this is, of course, you guys know that picture, right? This is more of our sisters. So we're kind of like a group, a girl game.
So I think one of the things that's also really important. So we gave you a really nice foundation for understanding the history of who we are. And then what you don't have is what happened in between. So you hear Lisa talking about, you know, reigniting that, you know, that power, that understanding that we had. And so we only have just a couple minutes here, and I'm going to just take 2 minutes just to kind of give you just a little brief overview of what happened in these last 200 years. But you hear about the American Revolutionary War, and what you don't really hear too much about is inside of that war was one of the most highly funded wars on U.S. soil, which was called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. And the Sullivan-Clinton campaign was specifically designed to eliminate all Haudenosaunee people out of New York State area so that this land could be settled. The lands downstate, in particular the New York City area, was becoming overpopulated. And up here we had these beautiful lush lands that you see every day. And we were really, really highly skilled agriculturalists that, you know, our fields just went on as far as the eye could see, and fruits that we would grow and the corn. I mean, it was unbelievable. If you go back into the record and read the accounts, the agriculture was so highly evolved, even more than you see it today. And so there was this desire to want to claim the lands from us. And so the campaign that was set out was basically to destroy all of our crops, all of our homes, and to push us out of these lands. So what happened is that was like the equivalent of an atomic bomb that went off in the middle of our Confederacy and pushed most of our people out. And so we're very fortunate in that our families decided to stay because a lot of Oneidas moved up into Canada and they moved to Wisconsin. So we have 3 different Oneida communities, even though we're all still one people. And so that happened almost 200 years ago. And we're now just getting back to the space of being able to reunite once again. And this is a little bit of what you see, but it didn't just affect the Oneidas, it affected all the Haudenosaunee people. And when we talk about the influence that the women had, the power our women had, well, the US government really didn't want American women to see that. And so there was really this suppression of Indigenous women's voice and power. And what was also then used was the tool of another tool of genocide, because this is all genocide. Don't be mistaken, this is genocide. And one of them was cultural assimilation. Our children were literally ripped out of our arms and put into what they call residential schools. And the residential schools were run, they were sanctioned by the US government, and they were run by the US Army to basically take children as young as 2, 3 years old and basically to educate them to become white Americans. And the goal was basically to culturally assimilate us to become white Christians. And so it was forbidden for us to speak our language. It was forbidden for us to practice our culture. We were, our ancestors that went through these schools, they were beaten, they were punished, they were raped, they were sexually abused, and a lot of them never ever made it out. They never left. And Carlisle was one of the very first schools, which is down in Pennsylvania outside of Harrisburg. And at that school, you will see there is a cemetery of over 200 children. And those were of bodies that were found there on campus. And of that, some of the children don't even have a name. They're just unknown on their headstone. There's no other schools for children in this country that have cemeteries, just the ones for American Indian people. So I challenge each of you to think about in your studies, ask the question, when you're looking at anything in history.
Challenge the books.
Challenge the books. Ask, where were the American Indian people in this story and in this piece of history that I'm learning? Ask that question, because there is a systematic erasure of American Indian identity that is built within institutions of higher education. It's also built within the laws and the framework of this country. So I studied law. If you go all the way back, where there's the doctrine of discovery, the manifest destiny, that is in the law of this country. The very first land case about property cites that doctrine of discovery, which says that American Indian people don't have souls. They're not Christians, and therefore they don't have a soul. You can kill them, you can take their land.
They said we were the wild animals that lived on the prairies and lived in the forests, just
Right.
like the deer and the antelope.
And so that's in the very first case regarding real property in this country that gives Americans the right to own our land. And just so you know, that it was cited as recently in 2010 by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Oneida land claim case. So she's saying we don't have souls. And the Supreme Court affirmed it.
In 2010.
2010. Yep. So on that, I know we're at the top of our hour here in speaking, and I know a lot of you have class, but please, I do challenge you to ask, where are the Native American people? Where are the Indigenous people in the context of the story? And we want to thank you so much for your time today, and remember that we're still here.
Yeah, when you see us on campus, because we'll probably be around a lot more, because I'm a connection to all these amazing women that you're going to see. If you see us walking around and you see us in our ribbon skirts, be proud of us. Remember your own selves on how we gave you that influence, and you should be very proud that we're even still in existence, and that we're still speaking our truth, and that we're reclaiming our narrative, because that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's why me and Michelle are here. We're making sure that we tell our own stories. Don't let anybody else tell your story anymore, and that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, and also that we're founded on principles of peace. So you have to understand that, right? So, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to explore, and certainly don't be scared, right? I just went through the foundation of who we are. So, with that, I just want to thank you all again. Now again.
I know some of you have class, so thank you. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? And I'm ready with the mic. I know I went up the hill a few times over the summer to prepare myself for just this moment.
Don't be scared, you just look scary.
Oh my gosh. Everybody has class. Yeah. Those folks have like, we'll have our crew.
Hi, thank you so much. I just had a quick question about like the choosing of clan mothers. Is that like just a bloodline thing, or is there like a process to that? I'm just intrigued.
So there's it really does generally run by bloodline, right? But there are times also then where there may not be a woman within the family to pass that to. And so what happens in that case is it then goes back also to the clan. So let me just start with looking at like the bloodline, right? So for instance, when a clan mother passes, it's usually the women, the sisters, or I should say her daughters, who would have a discussion among themselves who they believe would be the best person to fill her shoes of leadership. They say that our leaders have to have 7 spans thick of skin because of what you have to be able to go through and endure to be a leader. So they look at in terms of who's prepared to be able to go through that process, who will be there to listen to the people and really be able to, to verbalize, what's going on for them, because she's ultimately the confidant for the chief, and the chief is only the eyes and ears for the people. He's the spokesperson. He doesn't act on his own behalf. So she informs him of what direction he's supposed to go because he's acting on behalf of the clan. Does that all sound familiar, right? Like when you think about how your representatives are supposed to be in government? Right, exactly. So now you know where that all comes from. But when there's an instance when there isn't that female, descendancy in the bloodline to be able to pass that title on to, then the clan would then decide, among those families who would be best to fill that.
They have certain criteria to meet as well. And one of the biggest things that is a big no-no is people saying, ooh, I want to be the clan mother, I want to be the clan mother. Now, why do you think that? Why do you think we don't want someone saying, ooh, me, pick me? Yeah.
Because you have to earn it.
No, not that you have to earn it, that this person is actually probably looking out for themselves, right? Yeah, they're not looking out for the people. And when you're a clan mother, and I hated this growing up, I hated it. I'm telling you right now, I hated it. When your mother is a clan mother, she's the mother of the whole clan. That means you have 800 brothers and sisters. And so here I am, me, mom. My mom would have to be equal to everybody as if they were her own children. And that's very hard to do when you have to look at your own child, and if they're fighting and if they did something wrong, and then there's another kid that's still in your clan and they're going back and forth, you have to look at them both as your children. And so that's another thing that some women find hard to do. So that's kind of a hard job to be a clan mother.
Hi. So I know you guys have been talking a lot. You've been using a lot of native language lately throughout this whole process. Is that something that you were taught when you were young by like, one person in your family, or is it your grandmother's job to kind of teach everyone that language? Because I know it's gotten lost over the years.
One of the reasons we don't. How many speak their native language here? Their first language. Are there any? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, kind of. You guys are so lucky, and it makes me so happy to see that. And where do you learn your language from? Where did you learn your language from?
I grew up like in my native country, so
That's amazing. I'm growing up in my native country, and I barely know enough language. And the reason why I don't know my language is because of those boarding schools. So around the 1800s, I'm not sure the exact timeline, but when those children were ripped away from their families and put into these boarding schools, one of the things is that language. One of the chief Colonel Pratt, his biggest thing was to kill the Indian and save the man. And so one of the things that he did to kill the Indian was take away everything that was his identity, that made him who he was, and that was the language. So he would beat whoever spoke their language, and they cut their hair, and they made them wear, pants and weird clothes and itchy stuff. So that's one of the reasons why we lost our language. Another the reasons why we lost our language is because there's no influx of another country bringing that language in. Like there's always an influx of people coming in from your home countries that can bring you your language. This is our home country. Our language was ripped away from us. Our tongues were ripped out of our mouths, and that will you'll understand the pain that we feel. So when you say you know your own language and that you grew up in your own culture, that's amazing. That is really an amazing thing. So that's the language that we've learned. We have it's an act of Congress actually that had to bring us back our language because they realized what they did to us. So an act of Congress, they gave us these monies to establish schools or establish teachers to teach us our language. We are less than 1% of the people on the planet. So that means the percentage of Oneida speakers, I think there are like maybe 50 fluent speakers on the planet. So of those 50 fluent speakers, they're all mostly old people. And in order for them to sit there with a bunch of kids, you see your great-grandmother sitting there with a bunch of kids trying to teach them language? Yeah, it'd be too hard. So we have like language classes, and it's so hard. Language immersion is incredibly hard, but it does work. It's the best way we can do. I took 1.5 years of Oneida language, and I was fortunate enough to be able to pick up enough. And so like when I did my introduction, I make sure I do it all the time, so I don't lose it. Because if there's not another person to talk to, you're going to lose your language. So thank you for the question.
Any other questions?
I get too emotional. I said, did I get too emotional? It is a very, very sad topic, that topic. Yeah.
Okay.
So forgive me, but I don't remember the name of one of the stories that you were told earlier about he's like evil or like
Tadadaho.
Tadadaho. Did I say that?
Tadadaho.
Tadadaho. And how a part of the story was like necessary was forgiveness, so that he can lead the people. I'm wondering like how you guys feel about like forgiveness in community and against like people that hurt you and betrayed you, and like how necessary is forgiveness, because it's often seen as like a sign of weakness.
That's because that's American. Yeah, we're not American. That's why we can be here and talk about this, is because we do have forgiveness. And forgiveness isn't weakness. It actually takes that power away from that person or that group of people and puts it back where it belongs. I don't want to bring this up, but I was here when that incident happened with the posters with the Asian community. I was here, and it just broke my heart. And I remember one of the students was working with me over at the Long Year, and I remember hearing her talking about it, and I was just like, I didn't really know her. I just worked with her a couple times, and I went in and I said, don't react with anger, because if you react with anger, they're gonna get you. They'll be like, oh, you're that angry Asian girl. Like they like to call us the angry Indian girls, or the angry black girls, or the angry Puerto Rican girls. That's what they want to say, so they can keep doing that. So if you go in with peace and with love and react with that instead, it changes the whole story, right? How did they react? Do you remember how they reacted with that? They reacted with love, right? And all their symbols and signs that they put up were peace and happiness and love. And that changed the whole way that they responded. It changed the way that people looked at them. It changed the way that the whole reaction was up here. And that was really awesome. And I remember being up here and I was so angry. I'm like, I don't want these kids going home with a bad taste in their mouth about my home. Because, people like to say that it's Colgate University's, property, and it's not. This is my land. This is Michelle's land. The ground you're walking on, our great-grandmother's bones are in it. This is our home. And so when you leave here and you have a bad taste in your mouth about our home, I take it personally. And so that's why I went up to them and I apologized. I'm sorry that this is happening to you on my home. So that's the forgiveness that you have to do, is you have to react with that, not the way they want you to, or it's just going to keep being so much anger. But Michelle's an amazing person on forgiveness. She's helped me quite a bit.
So in our teachings, we have these 3 principles that are in the Great Law, which are peace, power, and righteousness. And you have to look at the language, right? Because those aren't really necessarily. Is this still on?
No, it was me. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Those weren't necessarily our words, right? But when you look at the principles of what they are, it is really understanding that power is love, right? So when I talked about a spiritual transformation of Tadadaho. One of the things, I don't know if I said it, but Tadadaho, his title descended as well as the chiefs and the clan mothers, and Tadadaho still exists today, and he's a peaceful leader. And so he exists today in the Onondaga Nation. His name is Sid Hill. Some of you may get to see him out speaking, or you'll read about him in the newspapers, or interact with him. Who knows, he might come here on campus one day and talk. But that is grounded in understanding that, when we're hurt, we have to find love within whatever happened, within whatever occurred. And so going back to that concept of the good mind that I talked about earlier, right? So if we continue to put anger out to people because we feel that they hurt us, that goes on and on and on and on. It doesn't end. And that's what we learned from our own history and from our own stories. So when I was talking about we were in a space of blood wars with each other, we were for generations. And, it got so fierce and ferocious, we were even into cannibalism. And not necessarily just for the sake of eating another human being because you're hungry, but it became about power, right? It was just based on a really sort of wicked mentality. And the thing that brought us out of it was understanding love, understanding the use of a good mind, to be able to come to a place of forgiveness, to be able to let those grievances go and find peace for somebody who hurt you, is one of the greatest things that you can do. And so I have to say this, knowing that our structure of our government and our people and our nations being bonded together has lasted over 1,000 years. And it's rooted in these principles, and forgiveness is at the core of it. And so if that doesn't speak, loud enough, it's a practice, right? So we can talk about it, and maybe it just doesn't sound like it's powerful enough or that it's meaningful enough to really bring about some kind of mental enlightenment where, the light bulb goes on. It's actually a practice that you have to be able to do, because once you understand forgiveness and you forgive others, then you understand it on a whole other level in your being and who you are, and that's what our people did. So, yeah.
When I also work for NACS, which is Native American Community Services, and it's out of Buffalo. And we put together this program. It's called the Good Minds Program, and people like Michelle and her husband, they speak on generational trauma and how to overcome different issues. And we have all these amazing people come in and help with that. And after you leave there, you feel like I always say, after I do these things, that you feel like you're floating around in a pink bubble. And like, what was that movie? Wizard of Oz. Remember how Glenda the Good Witch is floating in that pink bubble? And that's how I feel after I leave these gatherings. And one day, it was the end of last semester, and I'm walking across the quad, and everybody's out there sunning themselves and enjoying, because it's been cold all winter, right? So everyone's out there enjoying themselves, and they're all studying for their finals. And I looked around and I said, wow, imagine if every one of these kids would think with a good mind and think in unity and peace the way we were taught. Imagine the stuff we could do. Imagine the stuff that would be different in the world. You think about it. Think about the peace, the power and righteousness that we speak on, and to bring that to your own community, your own little clique up here in Soviet land. And like, wow, because you got there, just amazing. Because your little brains like this, and numbers over your head, and clouds and stuff. And I'm like, if they were all, joined up with one, thinking as one, imagine the stuff that you could do. That's the kind of forgiveness that we have. Is we're instead of being like, we're mad at everybody, we're trying to bring everybody together and be like, come on, you guys, look around you. What we're doing isn't working. We got to make sure that we save what's been ruined so far, and that's been ruined from the consumerism and Americanized capitalism. And I'm going too far now, but
Never too far.
So I think just to follow up on that point, one of the things that is a really, really big difference in our worldviews is this Western culture and the higher institution that most of us have been educated in really forces us to think about the individual. So we think about my career, my life, my home, my car, my whatever it is, it's mine, right? It's really kind of focused on yourself and who you're going to be in the future, how much money you're going to make in the future. It's always like forward thinking in the future. Well, the one commonality we have is the future, but our future and how we look at it is very, very different. We don't look at it individually. In fact, we don't even think about ourselves other than the actions that we're going to take that are going to impact 7 generations into the future of kids we don't even know yet. Our great, great, great grandchildren, right? Like 7 generations down. What actions are we taking today that are going to impact those 7 generations? And we have to do it together, right? So we're actually reaching this place in our world where we're going to be forced to really think that way, right? And I'm sure many of you think about that now in terms of the issues and challenges that we face. Climate change, one of them, right? The environment, the water. What happens when we don't have clean water to drink? Right? Is it going to be a filter that saves us all, right? Or do we need to change our behavior so that there will be clean water, because our conduct today makes sure that 7 generations from now, they're going to have clean water to drink. So that's the really, really big difference in the way that we think, right? And so these institutions, when we come to them, we have a really hard time as Indigenous students, because we're sort of really forced to kind of think in a very different way that's very jarring to the understanding of who we are as people. But I think that's just one distinction. So take that with you, think about it. Think about, with the studies that, you're looking at, there will be a time when it doesn't matter what car you drive, doesn't matter what house you live in, because we might all be forced to not drive cars. We might all be forced to live together and find shelter together under some place, or find some way to drink clean water together, or breathe clean air. right? So just take those little things with you. But keeping with balance, right? So we talked a lot about the women today. And that's very important in understanding who we are. We do have a balance and a place for our men. So my husband actually is here today, and he wanted to share some words. So I'm going to pass this mic to him.
I got one.
You have one.
I got
He's all sad.
Yeah, I travel with my hijack the frequency. So we usually present together, and I've traveled all over the world and spoke, also going up traditional, and understanding these stories and how to answer your question about how do you forgive. I want to address that. So within the story, this man, Tanadaho, if you understand his evolution, he was a young boy, had a lot of power, and his mother didn't know how to handle that power. And so she would take him to the woods and leave him there further, or, started with an hour, then 2 and 4, and then it built and built and built until eventually she just abandoned him in the woods. Alone, child in the woods by himself to defend himself. So he befriended the animals around him, right? And so he used to cry and wail for the loss of love, right? As any child would for their parent. Yes. We have some people like that you go in society today where they're searching for that space and filling that void. And with that void, they fill it, right? With capitalism, consumerism, alcohol, drugs, whatever, all these other vices or sins, right? They fill that void. You may be doing it yourself. We have also, right? It's human nature. And so once you start understanding this man who had all this power, that was where his anger was coming from, was the loss of that core element of what he needed, right? So Jagutsusei represents the balance of bringing that love back, right? But as a process of that 3-part process, right? So you talked about peace, power, righteousness, love, thankfulness, right? And the other piece of forgiveness. How do you forgive, right? I joke when I speak. How do you forgive someone for eating your uncle? Yeah, right. I had someone say it depends on which uncle. But so when you're thinking about forgiveness, I'll give you a story. I was an elder in another Native community, indigenous community, who was at a court hearing in Canada, and one boy had kicked another boy in the back and broke his back. He was paralyzed from the waist up. And so in the court, they're about to give his sentence. And the old man stood up in the court and said, "Are you willing to give them to me for a year?" So because there's a traditional man, 2 Native children, they said yes. So they gave this boy over to the custody of this elder. So the next day, he took the boys out on a canoe, and they rowed out to an island. And this one boy who did the kicking picked up this other boy, carried him off the canoe. They unloaded all the boxes that were there. And the old man rowed away and said, "You, because you have hurt this boy, are now accountable for his safety and his protection for a year." It's accountability. That's what we did with Tandaho. We forgave him, but his accountability is to protect all people, because that's how many people he hurt. So when you think about what you do and the choices you make and the actions that you take when you injure somebody, how can you imagine how that person should hold you accountable? And become that person's protector. Right? So we've done a lot of stuff. We've created videos, the indigenous response to Me Too, where we actually talk about sexual abuse and different situations in the Me Too movement. Right? We talk about the indigenous perspective. We actually talk about that. And we talk about what does accountability look like. And as I'm a trained counselor, and I've sat in rooms and groups with women and families of people who have been abused in a variety of different ways. Right? And our families, our ancestors were abused in a variety of different ways. So you sit in enough rooms and let Native people, you get to experience all of it. Right? And I had to sit there and look at my own personal actions and think about the time when I didn't defend somebody, when I didn't stand up and say, "That's wrong, don't do that." Or when I myself said or did something that hurt somebody else. So now my daily actions have to be accountable to make a change. That's what they're asking you to do in your studies, in your books, no matter what your major is. Think about what is the accountability for the world, for the universe, because natural law doesn't care if you're here or not. Mother Nature will still be here when you're gone. But just like anything else, if you get a speeding ticket, what happens? You get a fine, right? What if you had two? A really big fine. What happens if you're drinking while you're driving? Prison, right? Okay, so you know the consequence of that. What happens if you pollute on water? Is there a fine? Is there a prison time? Or do you get to go back and enjoy the water? It's gone. It ain't coming back. Not while you're here. And not about those other generations to follow. Right? So whatever your major is, you're all part of the system. We're all in this together. We all have to figure out together as one mind how we can work together and find that peace, right? Thankfulness, love, the power, the true power, and forgiveness. Right? And find a balance where we can all be together. All right. That's all I have to say.
So it's coming close to 1 o'clock. I want to thank Michelle and Lisa and Neil for being with us today and sharing with us today. It was beautiful. And yes, now I go into my program coordinator spiel. Please make sure you throw everything away and stack chairs if you can. But just a round of applause for Lisa and Michelle.
I think that I will be back for sure.
Yes.
In
October
16th, and we will actually be screening the film that we created called An Indigenous Response to Me Too. So you see the film, and then we have a discussion afterwards.